This week, we have something a little bit different for you on the 1855 podcast. I'm Sam Temple. With Logan Ledman, we have been charting the course of Minnesota history through Mary Lethert Wingard's book, North Country. It is an incredible history of the state of Minnesota and does a great job encapsulating everything, and we are putting together this podcast series to help people either read through the book, or if they don't have the time to read the book, at least get an understanding of this great work and this important history of the state of Minnesota. This week we're taking a step back. We won't be covering a chapter, but we still wanted to explore and dig a little deeper into this history that Logan and I care so much about. What we're going to do is look back in an interview we did in January of 2017 for a documentary we produced called The Peoples of Faribault. We interviewed local historian Larry Richie about his studies and about the indigenous people of the area. So Faribault is a small town in southern Minnesota. It was officially platted out in the year 1855, and it was founded by a man named Alexander Faribault, who was a mixed-race, part Dakota, part French-Canadian individual, and he has a unique history, a bit of an outlier for the state of Minnesota. We've mentioned him a few times in the podcast. He's come up a couple times in the book, and specifically, this interview explores the history of the Wahpekute band of the Dakota people, who primarily were the primary indigenous group living in Faribault. And we talk about in this interview not only what the life for the Wahpekute was pre-contact with white Europeans and Americans, but also what it's like after the U.S.-Dakota War. Now, we don't get into the specifics of the U.S.-Dakota War. We'll be doing that in upcoming podcasts. There weren't any battles for the U.S.-Dakota War in Faribault, so this interview primarily focuses on the city of Faribault's contact and relationship with the Dakota people and how that extends to Alexander Faribault himself. So we hope you enjoy this conversation. You'll hear Logan's voice is a little higher pitched than it is now. So we hope you enjoy this interview from January of 2017 with Larry Richie.
Well, we normally like to start these by just having you tell us your name.
I'm Larry Richie.
And do you live here in Faribault?
I farm about 7 miles southeast of town.
All right. Fantastic.
Born and raised on the same farm.
All right. Now we'll just move right on into the questions. What was life like for Native Americans prior to contact with Europeans?
Difficult. And on a winter day like this, you would say it would have been very difficult. The Wahpekute tribe of the Dakota Nation are the Indians that were living around here. They moved into this area, we believe, about 1600. And they were here until 1850, so for about 250 years, this was their home. But they was very much a wandering tribe of the Dakota. They moved a lot, depended totally on hunting and fishing and gathering. So they had to know nature very well. They had to be able to adapt to what nature threw at them. And because they were moving a lot in the winter times, we found, for example, in 1834, when Alexander Faribault was trading with the Dakota, they went down on the upper part of the Des Moines River to spend the winter. Alexander Faribault went with them. So by going 100 miles, you could, it would be a little bit warmer, and the winter would be not quite so long. Probably start a week later in the fall, and the spring might come a week earlier. And they were near a lot of game down there. They were closer to the buffalo. And so this group of people, they lived along the Strait and Cannon rivers, talking about the Wahpekute, and also a part of this group lived along the Minnesota River. And again, we think that the reason that they split up that way is so that when the Indians that were here wanted to hunt buffalo, they could depend on relatives out there to help them with supplies, a place to live, things like that, that was closer to where there were buffalo. So a people that's moving a lot and very dependent on nature,
What was the initial relationship like between Europeans and the natives?
The Indians needed what the traders had, and the traders needed what the Indians had. So it was pretty much a mutual respect. One of the early traders is Alexander Faribault's father, Jean Baptiste. When he starts trading near Minnesota down on the Des Moines River in 1798, the country is not even 25 years old. So this is the edge of, this is the frontier then. And he trades there for 4 years. And then he comes up on the Minnesota River. That's where Alexander Faribault was born in 06. And of course, Alexander grows up to become this trader. But an interesting part is that during the War of 1812, Alexander Faribault's father is captured. They're actually living at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. And he gets captured, and so Alexander Faribault's mother takes Alexander and his sister Lucy to Winona, Minnesota, and they live with the Indians for 4 years, or about 4 years. And that's really Faribault. Alexander Faribault lives with 1 foot always in each world. 1 foot in the Dakota world and 1 foot in the white man's world. And he is pulled back and forth, but he never turns his back on the Dakota people. He brings out the best in everyone. So as a trader, I really marvel at his life for what he was able to do. And you have to realize he's building a town while they're doing this, you know. So Alexander Faribault's relationship with the Indians was very, very good, as was most of the traders. Alexander Faribault's wife is part Indian. Many of the early people of Faribault, Bully Wells' wife is Alexander Faribault's sister's sister, or is Alexander Faribault's wife's sister. So, and that was very common for the French traders to take a Dakota wife. It made trading a lot easier, but it also put another obligation on the trader. If you were a part of our community, then you have to accept some of our values, and their values was very much one of community ownership, whereas the white man's idea of ownership is that individuals own land and property, and so there had to be a melding of those two concepts of way of living. And that was probably the most difficult part of Alexander's life, to try to bring those people together that way.
And you mentioned that there was a mutual respect among the different groups. So starting from that mutual respect, what eventually caused what would become known as the U.S.-Dakota War?
Basically, the first white men that were here were traders, got along good with the Indians. The second group of people that started to come, which was after the Minnesota became a territory. Before it is just the frontier, and it is. But in 1849, when we become a territory, that starts to open up the waves of white people that are coming, and those people are interested only in land and ownership of land, and the government is going to give them land almost for free, or like $1.25 an acre. Under preemption, they could get land, and so that's the change. Before they can come, they have to get agreements with the Indians to have access to the land. There again, Alexander Faribault gets put right in the middle. He's the interpreter at Travis de Sioux, or one of the interpreters. He's halfway between the Indian side and halfway between the white man's side. And so he's got to try to get the best deal he can out of it for his people who are Indian. And yet he knows that from a business standpoint, the white man is trying to get this land very cheap. And so that's where you start to see the first tensions starting to build. A lot of those treaties, we call them treaties. I'm not sure if that's a good word for it, but they moved the Indians off the land in exchange for the white men saying, we will help you with food and things like that. So most of the Indians have to move. They didn't all move from Faribault. Faribault kept quite a few Indians here with him. Even as late as Mrs. Edward Crump, she came in '53 with her husband. They built one of the first hotels down on Main Street. She counted 38 bark-covered homes, and we believe them were that was her way of saying they're Indian homes. The Indians that lived here did not use hides on most of their homes. We don't have that buffalo. We never had buffalo in any great number around here. So most of their homes were bark covered, either as a teepee or as a wigwam. That gives you an idea of how many were here with Faribault, and that's about 5 years after we became a territory. The Indians were supposed to have moved, you know. They were not very happy with having to move, of course, you know. And Faribault does everything he can to keep as many Indians. A lot of them are his family, his relatives. And then you've got the whole issue of, okay, what if you're half Indian and half white man? You know, are you expected to move? And of course, and then you get children, and they too have the same question, you know. So it was a first indication that if you try to solve your problems by dividing people up into groups, it don't work. Whether you're doing it by race or religion or rich and poor, when we start dividing people up, then we becomes you against me, or we against them. And the whole system of reservations and division of people tends to create more problems than it solves. And that's really what was happening. And this was happening in the states farther east too. This was not, Minnesota is not an anomaly to this. This was going on very early. So when the white men, when a few of them come, they said, let's take the census of the people, but we won't count the Indians, of course. So they get marginalized right from the get-go. And when you do that, society then says, well, they're not one of us, you know, let's get them out of there. Let's get them out of here. I don't want them near my home. And that's what it was all about. And people were hell-bent on getting rid of the Indians. And this is before the Uprising. One way or another, there's a lot of editorials in the papers, especially a little bit west of here, where it's not surprising that the Uprising of 1862 took place along the Minnesota River where it did. Them people were absolutely hostile towards the Indians. If you read the editorials in their papers, they are telling you, we're going to get rid of them damn Indians. I mean, and it didn't make any difference whether they were Dakota or the Winnebago were living south of Mankato on a reservation there. They were going to get rid of them. They wanted that land to farm. And they didn't make no secret about it. If the Indian had anything of value, it was to be taken, was the attitude of much of the white community, in fact, I'd say most of the white community. Faribault is almost a isolated incident of where Indians were where there was somebody to try to bring them into the greater community. We had, millions of acres of land that we gave to white people, or sold it to them, like I say, for $1.25 an acre under preemption. But we didn't have an acre of land for an Indian. I mean, he couldn't get an acre of land. So the uprising, if you get pushed hard enough, if you get hungry enough, if you get hopeless enough, it's what happens. It's wars, and usually there are reasons for wars. either some person or some group or somebody is getting marginalized or something. And that's what was happening then, and both sides paid a terrible price for it.
And could you give us a brief summation of the uprising?
Well, I'll just give you a little bit of a summation of how it affected Faribault, maybe.
Sure.
Alexander Faribault raised a company of men. I think there was, I forget how many, it started out about 40 men. Within 2 days, I think it was, of the uprising. And in a few days, he had a full company. Participated, his boss was Henry Sibley, who became the military officer in charge of the white man's response to the uprising. So Alexander Faribault acted as his interpreter. He was in the field of battle for 2 months. And what to take out of that, I would take, when Alexander Faribault left town to participate in the putting down of the uprising, he was a hero. He had raised the first company of men to join the battle, responded immediately, played a major role as an interpreter, along with his son. And when he came back to Faribault, he was despised. He was the one who treated these Indians well, who had wanted to make them a part of our community. And he still wanted to keep some of them Indians here. And life became very difficult for him. He writes a letter to the people in the town of Faribault, asking the people just to leave my Indians alone. Just leave us live in peace. That's all I ask. And he says, I will await your reply. And there never was a written reply. But over the next about 6 years, they managed to get all the Indians out of here. The Indians, of course, after the uprising, the Indians were moved to Fort Snelling. There were a few that stayed here. And most of those is because of relatives. From Fort Snelling, the Indians were put on a barge and taken down the Mississippi and up the Missouri River to Nebraska and put on some land that was not good enough to farm. But Alexander Faribault wanted to keep some of the Indians that did not participate. And for example, the Winnebago, none of those had participated in this uprising. They were all loaded on the boat because they were Indians. And so Alexander gets pulled between this town that he wants to build and the fact that he wants to make the Indians a part of the town, have them be a part of the town. And that weighs heavily on Alexander. And so he tries to support the Indians with food. And this was going on before the uprising started. You know, Alexander built a real nice house downtown in 1852, 53. He lived there 3 years. 3 years. And then he moves up on the hill up here where the blind school is, you know. Builds a small house up there. He moved up there because he had a place for his Indians, a place where they could live. That was part of the land that he had preempted when he set out the town. And he gave everything up to try to help those Indians. And he tried to ask the community to help, you know. You see, the thing is, if nobody accepts you, you can't get a job. I mean, effectively, they starved him out. And pretty soon he's broke. He's got a little interest in a this is talking about Alexander Faribault. He's got a little interest in a flour mill up at Fergus Falls. He moves up there with his wife. Leaves everybody here behind. His wife dies about a year or two later. He has apparently kind of a stroke or some health issue. Has to move back to town. Lives with one of his children, or with, I think, more than one children at different times. The people of Faribault, few of the businessmen raised some money for him, so he's got enough to live on. And he was a wealthy man. He wrote out checks for $10,000 when he was in the banking business. I've seen copies of the checks at the History Center in St. Paul. He was a talented man, but a man with a heart, I mean, and a soul. His word was good. He backed those Indians, and it cost him his life. He really died a broken man. He was proud of the town that he had laid out, but he thought it could have been more. And I think he would have wanted us to know that. Don't leave people behind. You know, when they took the census, about 10 years, about 12 years before he died, he's listed as a white man. In 1880, before he died, the last census, he's listed as an Indian. And I think he'd be proud of that. I don't know who filled that line out, but somebody did. And that kind of reflects his life. He's got one foot in each world.
Thank you for that. And could you now go into what happened to the Dakota and other Native Americans after the uprising ended?
After the uprising, most of them were loaded on a boat and sent down the Mississippi. And there are still people around. I was at Mankato at the powwow. They have a powwow in Mankato every year. Commemorates the hanging of the Indians at Mankato. And I got talking to different, and there are a lot of Indians there from all over the country. But we got talking about where you're from. There's people from Nebraska, and I asked them, and so do you know your heritage? Yeah, we're Wahpekute. And I thought, wow, there are still some around. People that, had called this their home. They'd come back to this area to see what it was like, And the only reason they know that is because their names of their grandparents or great-grandparents were written down when they were loaded on the boat. It's not that somebody didn't write their name down. You can find those lists if you want to go look at them. So they were able to trace their heritage back and see who, in some cases, they were imprisoned. Their relatives were imprisoned. And so I got to talk to some real Wahpekute. And I guess I would put it this way: they are resigned to the world is what it is, and we got to make the best of it now.
You mentioned these Native Americans were being loaded up onto boats and sent down a river. What was the perception people had towards Native Americans at that time?
Get them the hell out of here. And they brought that with them from out east. This was not a Minnesotan thing. But in general, the Indians was peaceful, caring group of people. I know we, call them savages and all that stuff, but if you really look at them, Alexander Faribault never even had a lock on his trading post. Never even locked the door. They were respectful. It just that in some cases their values was a little different. But we all have different values, and we got to learn to accept others.
And finally, what is the state of Native American cultures today?
They're still paying the price. There's a price to be paid if you're going to divide people up. And you see that not only in our country, you see that in other countries too. We see that in the Middle East. How if we divide people up, it's hard to bring them back together. And I think we're working on it. It's a never-ending process. And it's not just the Indians, of course. It's all groups of people. We have to have, if we're going to say we have a community, it's got to mean something. It's got to mean there's room for everybody that's here. And that means a job, too. I mean, I don't mean just, it means an education. It means, a job for, it means everybody's got to be responsible. And so they're still paying a discrimination against the Indian has been well documented and has went on for hundreds of years. And are we making progress? Some days it looks like we are. Some days makes us aware that we got a long ways to go too.
If you want to hear Larry Richie's interview in the context of the documentary, check out the Peoples of Faribault episode available on YouTube. We want to thank Larry Richie again for that wonderful interview. It was a very important one for us on our journey and our development as documentary producers, and Larry has been a wonderful advisor and mentor as we explore this local history. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we'll see you next time to discuss further the history of our North Country.